Hello and welcome to my channel. Today's video is called How the Conditioned Mind, or Ego, Compares to Personality. Ego, or the conditioned mind as I like to call it, is a word Sigmund Freud coined to describe the mental identity that we adopt in an effort to minimize suffering in our individuality. Most people don't see it as minimizing suffering. They see this as fitting in or filling a role in family or community. But that's the same thing when examined a little closer. What is it like when we don't fit in and we don't fill our role as expected? We suffer. Other synonyms for ego or the conditioned mind are belief system, worldview, and self-image. When we think of self-image, we think of the mental attitude one has about their identity when compared to some mentally established standard. The most important thing to realize here is that all of these so-called personal attributes are generated in the mind. Self-esteem, self-confidence, and self-worth are all mentally imagined attitudes that have no real existence at all. There's really no reality to one's self-image. It's just a fantasy. One can believe they are good-looking or ugly. One can believe they are smart or stupid. Belief does not necessarily reflect the truth. So what is true about us as relative individuals? I call the divine personified in duality the personality. And that is what is true about us in the relative dimension. When we are born, the divine impulse has willed us into existence and as an individuation in multiplicity. In truth, we are still the divine one, but we appear separate, as does every form. Forms include the planet, bodies, thoughts, feelings, and everything we can perceive from a subject-object perspective. Even the soul is a form, albeit a non-physical one. This subject-object relationship is the relative or phenomenal world. The one, God, Source, or the divine, is the absolute or fundamental. It is without opposite. It's non-dual. In seeking the truth, it's vital to get a grasp on the intangible picture of relative reality as compared to the absolute reality. From our relative perspective as individuals, we can look at this absolute and call it the absolute reality, when in actuality it's the only reality. This often creates paradox for seekers. To bridge this gap or paradox in the linear mind, one needs to understand that language only exists in the relative world. Language requires duality, subject and object relationships. The absolute is not subject or object. It's all there is. This thought process doesn't compute in the linear thinking mind and is the reason everyone is not already recognized as awake to the truth of who we are. They can't recognize the truth without the unconscious watcher, which abides in the frontal lobe, creating paradox in thought. This unconscious watcher is the conditioned mind, ego, or mind-generated sense of self. In conscious awakening, the unconscious self becomes quiet and recognition of the truth occurs deeper in the frontal lobe where the conscious self abides. Much deeper levels of consciousness exist than this, but they're not really necessary for a fundamental realization of one's true nature to be revealed. Language is based in the past and projects into the future. The process of giving labels to all forms is language. Language is established in the past, and when we communicate, we use these labels to describe forms. Through language, we communicate projections of our intention or will into the future. Because thought occurs before language, even present-time communication is arising from the past. This is the reality behind the statement, "There's no such thing as a true thought." The one true source abides in presence, therefore the truth of who we are abides in presence. Even recognition of absence, which is the experience of the non-dual or unmanifested, occurs in presence when viewed from a relative perspective. Therefore, language pulls us out of the absolute consciousness to some degree. How one evolves to the point where they can remain conscious and still think and use language is not a topic for this video, so I won't go into that here, but we do evolve to that point. The ego, or conditioned mind, is like language. It arises from the past. For example, if we are bitten by a dog as a child, a fear of dogs may develop. The fear is generated conditioning because there is no evidence that all dogs bite. Quite to the contrary, in fact. So we go through life fearing dogs based on a conditioned belief system developed in the past. In response to the fear, we generate resistance to an imagined future where we could be bitten again. This resistance is the ego. In this way, we develop an entire identity based on conditioning from past experience. This conditioning takes the form of mental resistance that is then manifest as physical resistance. The conditioned mind, or ego, is mind generated from the past and projects its intention, or mental will, into the future. Ego cannot abide in total presence. It simply dissolves. One who has an awakening in consciousness experiences this ego death completely and all at once, in the eternally present now. This is a dramatic loss of established belief systems and self-image. The paradigm shift from past-generated identity to present-time recognition of the divine is a very powerful experience. This takes one's awareness from the relative world of subject-object relationships to the absolute and purely subjective experience of present-time recognition. This is a big step out of the conditioned mind, and it doesn't usually last. The ego, conditioned mind, or mind-generated sense of self has great momentum that is even anchored in the body's cellular memory. Thus we awaken and go back to sleep. It's often called the got it, lost it process. The majority of people are fully identified with the conditioned mind. It's who they believe themselves to be. They abide in the ego, unconscious of the one true source. These people have a strong influence in keeping us from staying awake to our true nature. Egos support each other's illusions, so when one experiences an ego death, they have the whole of humanity dragging them out of the divine recognition. It can take many cycles of awakening for one to stay awake, and many do not fully awaken in one lifetime. Of course, there's the rare individual who has an abiding awakening all at once. For the majority, as consciousness grows, we realize we're not the ego. Many people who are conscious enough to know they are not the ego consider themselves enlightened or whole. They have awakened to their true nature at some level of divine mind. Unfortunately, this is not wholeness. There is much more to it than that. My video titled Awakening as Compared to Enlightenment covers this topic at a rudimentary level. One who is at the got it, lost it phase of their process may not recognize that they have lost the eternally present awakened consciousness and are once again in the grips of the ego. These people often embody what is sometimes called the enlightened ego, which is not actually enlightened. The enlightened ego is a topic for another video, so that's all I'll say about it here. Through the process of awakening in consciousness and going back into the unconscious conditioned mind, a person's ego can create a conceptual framework of what the awakened state was perceived as. From this transition into and out of consciousness, religions are born. The ritualistic dogma many of us dislike about religion is a tree grown from the seed of truth, but watered with the illusions of the conditioned mind. It's like truth covered in lies. This is why so many of us feel the truth in a religion and then get frustrated and drop it. In an effort to make sense of this interplay between the conditioned mind and the awakening process, most fairly conscious people in spiritual circles view the ego as a normal aspect of human nature that is required in very small doses to function in the world. In the East, they have a term, lesha vidya, which means faint remains of ignorance. This term describes that after awakening to our true nature as one divine unity, it is necessary to retain a slight ignorance of this truth in order to function and survive in the world of duality or subject and object. The term lesha vidya may work fine for Eastern seekers, but I believe we need an English term to describe that which is divine in form. I never recognized as truth the idea that we need some degree of ego, and I spent about a decade engaged with the concept. I recognize the need for different terms to describe the conditioned mind and the divine individuality that we are all born with in the world of form. Personality fits this definition nicely. Personality used in this fashion needs to be considered the persona or mask taken on by the divine source as form is manifest in apparent duality. Since this is very close to the Latin definition, it works quite well. The self we are born with is this personality. It doesn't fundamentally change over time. Personality recognized in this manner includes all aspects of our individual biological makeup, our physical, mental, and feeling individuality. For example, the divine is manifest as left or right brain dominant, analytical or artistic. The body is manifest as more or less robust, with varying degrees of athletic potential. Our heart is manifest in various degrees of sensitivity and impulse related toward feeling connected to others. Thus, all human traits can be recognized as belonging to one of these three dimensions: consciousness, heart, or being and physicality. A baby comes into the world closely connected to the divine source. They have personality traits, but not an ego or conditioned mind. They are so close to the source that they don't differentiate between themselves and the environment around them. They experience no separation between objects around them, including people. From their perspective, they are the environment and everything in it. This is what some awakening experiences are like. It's common in an awakening to lose the sense of separation we've come to expect over a lifetime. These are usually referred to as experiences in oneness. The difference between a baby's experience of oneness and an adult's is that a baby is unconscious of that state that they are in. The experience of oneness is all they know, and the frontal lobe is not developed enough to recognize separation. An adult who experiences a state of oneness is usually conscious that it is happening. They can tell that something is drastically different in their perspective. In a related fashion, wild animals have individual personalities and live mostly in the present, but display little or no ego-conditioned mind. Domestic animals or pets display more conditioned mind and can be considered to have some degree of ego identity. Observing animals is a good way to see a personality without ego. Animals rarely focus in past or future, and when they do, it's easy to see. In humans, the mind's projections into past and future are a blend of ego and personality, which makes clear observation of it much more difficult. The personality's movement into past or future is operating on experience and conditioning without the emotional components based in fear and resistance, which the ego operates under. Where the ego only lives in the mind-generated past and future, the personality lives in the present and visits a conceptual future in order to make practical decisions in directing one's will. As stated, the difference with the personality is that its speculation into the future is not founded in resistance and fear. It's founded in present-time awareness, planning for the perceived future and using practical conditioning of the past as a tool. It's an action, not a reaction. Personality traits are the foundation on which the ego or conditioned mind is imagined. While the personality includes the genetics of a person, the ego in and of itself does not. Where the ego is born of developmental or experiential influences, the personality is not. The personality uses developmental and experiential influences as a tool to make realistic decisions. They are recognized as memory, not identity. The conditioned mind is made up of identity wrapped in developmental and experiential influences. The ego is an artificial embellishment that interweaves with the relative personal reality. Thus, it can be very hard to separate what is the apparent real self from the false mind-generated self. Over the developmental years, as conditioning is tailored to our personality, the ego grows in complexity. Once well established, usually by the age of 6, the ego begins to gain momentum in its influence over our lives. At some point, the ego usually goes through remission as identity is reworked. When teenagers go through the process of becoming truly separate individuals from their parents, they often go through a form of ego death. While this is an opportunity to awaken to their true nature as divinity individuated, They instead often seek a new but false sense of self that meets their needs in peer groups. Where the conditioned mind was once a reflection of what their parents expected, it becomes a reflection of what they perceive their peers to expect. This can be recognized as a form of resistance to the fear of not being accepted or confident in the imagined future. The same thing can happen to women when their children leave home, and in men when they can no longer compete as they once did. Any drastic change in life situation can generate an ego death. Retirement or movement into an assisted living facility are other good examples. When a person goes through some type of tragedy, this can also trigger an ego death. If a person is in a car accident and sustains a life-altering physical injury, the physical change causes mental egoic stress, which then generates emotions, which challenges the ego's illusion. When the ego fails to defend its position in the mind, it collapses, and this is an ego death. Ego death can be traumatic, but doesn't stay so for long. Ego death is often experienced as a huge relief because all the energy that was arising from the past and projecting into the future is dissipated. This often leaves one feeling wrung out, but at peace in the present moment. Soon after, a surplus of freed up energy is recognized, and one can feel strangely good in what the ego would have considered a bad situation. This is often how suffering generates awakening in consciousness. The use of this model for understanding the difference between the relatively healthy self and the self that needs to be transcended is only a conceptual tool. Once one is able to abide in recognition as pure present consciousness, this model will be of no use unless you're teaching others. Keep in mind that teachers don't clearly make the distinction between a conditioned mind and the relatively healthy use of mind that I am calling personality. As you listen to their teachings, you will have to make this distinction on your own. If you're confused like I was for many years, you can't stop thinking about how these concepts of self interact, and I hope this information will be useful to you. Thanks for listening, and may your journey be blessed.